Hello students, Mr. Young here with 22 for, it's called Excluded from Reform. So, there were a lot of good changes occurring during the Progressive Age. Things were looking up, but not for everyone. A large majority of the population were WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and basically a great deal of the country were these white Protestants from Western Europe, and they were primarily in charge of the Reform. And if you weren't one of them, then you either weren't a part of Reform, and you were usually discriminated against because they didn't like you if you weren't one of them. So this is more than just like African Americans. This is Catholics, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, Jews, anyone that wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So they were often left behind in the Reform movement and discriminated against before, during, and even after. So we're going to learn all about these groups today. So there were many groups discriminated against. We mentioned them on the prior page, and the government actually did very little to fix this for a long time. We're basically going to run through the groups one by one. And that's pretty much the lesson. So we'll start off with the Catholics, because that's probably the one that seems least likely. So the U.S. was predominantly a Protestant nation. If you think back when we learned, like, Chapter 1, the original colonies, most of them had, well, a lot of them had a religious implication involved, and they were almost always Protestants. Remember, Lord Baltimore wanted to create a refuge for Catholics when he formed Maryland, but very soon, when he started letting everybody in, the Catholics were outnumbered pretty quickly. So Protestantism has always been a majority population into the nation at this point, with Catholics being outnumbered. A lot of folks didn't like Catholic people because they were different, and a large part of it was a lot of the Catholic people coming into the country were part of that second wave of immigration, that second big wave in the late 1800s. So they were from Eastern Europe, so they already looked different, they sounded different, they didn't assimilate as readily as Western Europeans, and they were Catholic. So it kind of falls in line with this whole we don't like people that are different thing. There was an association, an anti-Catholic association created. It was called the American Protective Association. This was 1887 it was created, and they claimed that by 1895 they had 2 million members. 2 million members that pledged not to hire Catholics or sell them land and things like that, to basically discriminate against them. They also spread a lot of false rumors that Roman Catholics were trying to take over the country. So there's a little cartoon there of some Catholic guy plotting to take over the United States. Now, in terms of the Jews, there's actually not too much in your book. We already know that a lot of Jews left their homelands, particularly in Eastern Europe, because they were facing discrimination, anti-Jewish discrimination. And sometimes they would move to the United States to escape that, and then find there was discrimination here as well. It doesn't go into too much detail, though. In general, they were different to begin with, being from Eastern Europe, and faced a lot of that same discrimination. Some people refused to hire Jews, and some schools just wouldn't take Jewish students, some public schools. In terms of Asians, we've already actually talked about them a good deal. In a prior chapter, we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed, which cut off all immigration from China, and it was a 10-year act, and it got renewed twice. So there were 30 whole years where Chinese people weren't allowed to move to the United States. The Japanese ended up becoming severely limited in their immigration to the United States as well. President Roosevelt kind of had to cave into anti-Asian sentiments, and then had his gentleman's agreement with Japan in 1907, where they basically made a small quota of Japanese people that could come to the country. Actually, it hurt relations between Japan and the United States for quite some time. The Chinese and Japanese already in the nation, remember a lot of them came over to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, they faced a lot of discrimination and violence as well. They were blamed for driving down wages, and people didn't like them, and they would thought them as kind of less than human, not second-class citizens sort of thing. There was a law in California at one point and other states where they weren't allowed to own land. things like that, sort of your typical exclusionary ways. In terms of African Americans, we're all pretty familiar at this point with the plight of the African Americans. We learned a lot about them in Reconstruction, how they had sort of been freed, and then they had all kinds of rights with the radical Reconstructions, and then the rights were slowly taken away again with things like reading tests and stuff like that basically made it so they couldn't vote, like your poll tax, stuff like that, your literacy tests. And of course there are people that refuse to work with them and stuff like that. And as if that wasn't enough, in the year 1915, the Klan, the KKK, sort of had a rebirth in Georgia, and they were ironically a bit less exclusionary in who they hated. Before it was mostly about, we hate Republicans, we hate free slaves, and anyone that disagrees with us. And now they still hate black people, but they also hate Jews and Catholics and Asians and anyone that is not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And they terrorized all these different groups. In the South, it was mostly African Americans they terrorized, but out west, there was a lot of violence directed at Asians. There were sort of a lot more Asians out there. They were like the minority of the West. The Klan was often tied to violence against minorities, but not always. Sometimes it was just a standard old lynch mob, and lynch mobs were a big problem in the late 1800s and a little bit into the early 1900s, really up to 1916. What's a lynch mob? It's like an angry mob that kills people, sort of vigilante style. Usually it was almost always against minorities, and a lot of times for no reason at all, other than maybe there was an economic downturn and they felt that maybe this individual or this group of individuals is driving down wages, and so they would most often hang them. It was terrible. It would be like an angry mob coming to hang you for no reason other than you were born. As I mentioned, often the West, this violence was against Asians, whereas in the South it was more usually against African Americans. Now, for the most part, progressive reformers were discriminatory, not always on purpose, but for example, if a progressive reformer was helping the plight of the unions are, and that union doesn't allow any minorities in, then you're not helping any minorities, you're just helping, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. As a result, there wasn't a lot of progressive reform for minorities, and they had to make their own reform. Examples of this would be like Booker T. Washington. He had been born a slave and taught himself how to read, and in 1891 he founded the Tuskegee Institute, which I think we mentioned before. And his theory was that with education, African Americans could make more money, and with more piece of the economic pie, they'd have more leverage and more power to make nationwide reform. It's a pretty good idea. You have another African American reformer, W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was the first black man to actually earn a doctoral degree from Harvard. So he's a very educated man, and he believed that it was the right to vote that would eventually destroy a culture of prejudice and lynch mobs. Thought that they would, by getting more African Americans the right to vote, they could vote people in that would help them. He also played a somewhat tangent role in the creation of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still around today. Now, in terms of African American women, they formed their own sort of league, their own NAACP. It was called the National Association of Colored Women. Their main concern was fighting violence like those lynch mobs against African Americans. A key player in this was a woman by the name of Ida Wells. She published a book called A Red Record that showed the primary reason for lynch mobs against African Americans was that these African Americans were prosperous and often in competition with whites. So they weren't being lynched for, committing crimes. Their crimes were being prosperous African Americans and not being under the thumb of anyone. Ida B. Wells didn't stop lynching totally, but her sort of public informational campaign on lynch mobs really slowed the lynchings down. Other groups were discriminated against. We've mentioned the Jews, and they formed the Anti-Defamation League, which is still around. It was basically an organization to stop prejudice and discrimination against Jews. But you also had the population of Hispanic Americans exploded in the early 1900s, and they lived together in their own neighborhoods they were called barrios, and they would form these aid groups called mutualistas, which were basically aid groups to help each other obtain legal counsel and insurance, all things. So that's our lesson for today. Did we mention the Native Americans? I might have missed the Native Americans. They formed, I know it's in here somewhere. I just glossed over it by accident. The Native Americans, a main concern of them, of theirs, was improving their own station in life, helping each other out, and educating the American population on Native American culture. That was their big things. So that's our lesson. There it is. They are in there. All right. You've got your 10-point quiz here. 2 attempts. 5 questions, multiple choice, and that's the end of the chapter. We're going to be moving on to study day and then test day. And then we'll be seeing what chapter 23 has in store for us. All right. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a wonderful day.